Hi, this is Liz Waitakis. I'm the Executive Director of Docomomo US, and you're listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. While you hear a lot about architect Mies van der Rohe and his famous Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, you don't hear that much about the original client for whom the house is named. Today, you'll learn the real story of Dr. Edith Farnsworth from author Nora Wendl. Then we talk to Todd Gannon about architect Frank Israel, and authors Kevin Murphy and Marianne Hunting fill us in on women architects in the early days of modernism. Finally, we get tacos with our musical guest Gabrielle Stravelli. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. I really like doing musical guest interviews over food. The first culinary experience I had was with Monica Ryan, an amazing breakfast outdoors at Balthazar in New York City. This week, it's tacos al fresco in Durham at Nuvo Taco, formerly Nana Taco. If I could go back in time to favorite jazz greats, what would we eat? Well, there would be red beans and rice with Louis Armstrong. He would often sign his letters, red beans and ricely yours. There would be chili and a Heineken with Miles Davis, steak with Duke Ellington, chicken with Charlie Parker, apple brown Betty with Nina Simone, seafood and cornbread with Betty Carter, pork chops with Nancy Wilson, and dark chocolate with Sarah Vaughan. I'm guessing the experiences would be similar to smoking weed with Willie Nelson, making croissants with Julia Child, or having a double cheeseburger with Elvis.
And some nanner pudding.
Bon appetit. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Whenever we talk to people about the Edith Farnsworth House, designed by Mies van der Rohe and built in the late 1940s near Plano, Illinois, they say you should really talk to Nora Wendl. So I hope you people are happy, because to date, that's what we're doing. Returning podcast guest Nora Wendl graduated from Iowa State.
Go Cyclones.
And now she teaches architecture at the University of New Mexico.
Go Lobos.
She is co-author of Ave Maria, a fascinating story of Catholic faith, Florida real estate, Domino's Pizza, and one of the world's largest Frank Lloyd Wright collections. She's a poet. She is the former executive editor of the Journal of Architectural Education, and she's got a new book called Almost Nothing, Reclaiming Edith Farnsworth. She has presented, performed, exhibited, and held residencies at national and international venues. Welcome to our humble podcast, Nora.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nora, let's just cover the very, very, very basics before we dive into this. So in like 200 words or less, what is the Farnsworth House?
Oh, okay. The house is Mies van der Rohe's first house in the United States. It was built in 1951 in Plano, Illinois, which is about 60 miles west of Chicago. And it was built for Dr. Edith Farnsworth, who was a nephrologist, researcher, poet, kind of remarkable person who commissioned the structure from Mies. And it, has all the hallmarks of a Mies van der Rohe building in the American phase of his career. So it was an open plan. There are no walls interrupting the space. There's one primary core that holds the bathrooms and the kitchen cabinets. But otherwise, it's a completely glass house. And it has a steel structure running up the outside of the building, indicative of all of Mies's Chicago and American work, that sort of ornamental but also performative structure on the exterior. And it sits in a floodplain about 100 feet from
the Fox River.
The Fox River, yeah.
The famous Fox River that likes to flood every few years.
Oh, it loves to flood, yes.
What does a performative exterior mean?
So the structure of the house is, on the exterior, it's these I-beams. You can see them on the outside of the house, and they're actually holding the building up. I think the building hangs from those I-beams. And I would say for the Farnsworth House, I call them performative in that they are actually performing.
Right.
Those exterior I-beams are not functional in all of Mies's buildings. Sometimes they're purely ornamental, but this was a moment where the ornament is also holding up the building. So I suppose ornamental is maybe the phrase I should have used instead of performative, but
Performatively ornamental or ornamentally performative.
performatively ornamental.
Yeah. If you take them out, the building falls down.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Now, the genesis of this house has a certain mythology to it. And over the years, it was always kind of like Mies was dealing with this insane woman who had all these demands and who was in love with him and sued him and blah, blah, blah. And poor Mies, right, for having to put up with this chick.
Yeah.
But you've got the real story about what was going on. So let's start with, how did they decide to do this project together? I think it was a dinner party, right?
That's a great question. Yeah, the sort of received historical wisdom is that they met at a dinner party, and this is something that Edith writes about in her memoir. So I should say my primary source was her memoir. I mean, that was really where I went. And it was an unpublished memoir, and it's not chronological. It takes a lot of liberties with reality, but I think that's what I kind of loved about it. But in this case, Edith's recollection in her memoir of how she met Mies was at a dinner party. I mean, I certainly have questions about who set up the party. It was two good friends of hers, Georgia Lingefelt and Ruth Lee. And Georgia Lingefelt was somebody who was big in the literary world in Chicago. And these two women who lived together set up a dinner party. They invited Mies van der Rohe. They also invited Laura Marks, who is Mies's girlfriend, his partner in Chicago, I think, until the end of his life, with a few breaks in there. So all of these people are at a dinner party, and in Edith's recollection, she says, "Oh, I'd love to build a house and do something meaningful." And she asks Mies if he would be interested, and he says, "Yes, I would love to build any kind of house for you." And that's sort of how the arrangement begins.
And so they start on this project, and does it go easily to begin with?
I mean, I think that when things are ideas, they're easy. So I know that during the time of them discussing the house and what Edith wanted for it, they would go out to the site a lot. So Edith would drive Mies out to the site. She would also invite the folks who worked in his firm to come look at the site. And I think it was, in the realm of ideas. And this was a really exciting time for Mies's career that was in the realm of ideas, because he hadn't really built much in the U.S. outside of IIT's campus, which was at the time the Armour Institute. So, things were in the realm of ideas. And this was 1945, 1946, 1947, preceding and leading up to the Mies van der Rohe retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, which was, an exhibition that introduced Mies to the United States. It was about his buildings, and the buildings were in many ways about his philosophies of open space. It was, I think, a charged time of concepts. And, he told Edith, "Your house will be almost nothing. Like, don't worry about it. It's not going to be complicated. It will not cost you much. It will be an almost nothing kind of experience," right?
Have I got a deal for you, Edith
He
Farnsworth?
is full of pickup lines, it sounds like.
I know. There are a lot of pickup lines. So, she was a woman who loved ideas. She was brilliant. So I think it was a very enticing and interesting project. She spent a lot of time with him at his office, and she got to know the folks who worked there, and they would even draw the slides that she would present at conferences on nephrology. The architects in the office would draw them for her. So I think she was, interested in philosophies. So was Mies. They would have a lot of great conversations and spend a lot of time together. So I think it began pretty swimmingly, because it began in the world of ideas. And when she started to say, 3 years later, 4 years later, "Hey, wait a minute, where's my house?" then things got kind of real.
How long did it take for the house to get built?
I think she and Mies met in 1945. She purchased the land she wanted to build on in 1945. I think they met 1945, early 46 at the latest. And then the house, I believe construction begins in 1950. So
1950?
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, discussion preceding this. And I think when the rubber sort of met the road and she said, "I really want this house. I'm not kidding." Then, of course, Mies had it designed basically since the 1947 retrospective. They'd had a model since then. But there are a lot of details to figure out, and so I think it took some time to work those questions out, the questions of structure, of materiality.
And when they got going on it, it got expensive pretty quick.
It got expensive pretty quick, And I think some of that had to do with the Korean War and the cost of materials going up. But some of it also had to do with, initially Mies had proposed like just a concrete floor. They would, pour concrete and that would be the floor. And then, of course, it's Mies. So as soon as they start actually looking at it, he's like, well, let's think about travertine. You've heard of Roman travertine. Should we look at some of that? So,
not cheap.
Things,
Ka-ching, ka-ching.
cha-ching, right? So things start to get expensive, of course. And then who are you contracting to do this? Like, this isn't a typical build. This is something a little bit different. You have to hire people who are willing to be craftspeople, down to the detail of even the white painted steel, which of course had to be done in a way that would allow the person, the welding had to be done in a certain way, and then it had to be finished in a certain way to sort of dematerialize where the bolts were that were holding this thing together. And then it had to be painted in a very particular way. Like, it was essentially a bespoke object that was being built at the scale of a house. So, which isn't to say like, Mies did what Mies does, which is he created a remarkable, beautiful, elegant piece of architecture that's obviously stood the test of time. But I think when Edith met him and she heard almost nothing, and it maybe didn't sound like the process that she ended up going through in the end.
And at some point along here is where the story really diverges. There's one sort of mythical school, which is that Edith had a thing for Mies and she was spurned and she got mad and sued him. And then the other narrative is that, Mies was just late and unresponsive and kept jacking the price up, and she sued him for that. So which way did this really go, in fact?
Well, in fact, he sued her. So I believe the story I've heard, which I find compelling and believable, is that Mies wasn't making a lot of money. You can imagine. He had a house client where he was having martinis and late lunches and talking about ideas for 3 or 4 years, right? Like, Mies was a prolific architect, and I have a ton of respect for his work, but I think for him it was the art, it wasn't the business that was really the focus, which is probably why his buildings have stood the test of time. So it was actually Philip Johnson's accountant who looked at Mies's books and said, look, you've got to figure out a way to reclaim some costs here. You should probably sue Edith Farnsworth for fees you never got because they had no contract enforcing fees. And you should sue her for the work that you did as a contractor because you hired yourself to be the person who let out the work as well. You were basically the general contractor and the architect on this. And Mies followed that advice, and he sued Edith first. And she countersued, saying, you promised me an affordable house. You promised it delivered on time. You made these promises and you didn't hold up to them. So I'm countersuing you, actually. And she had motivation to do that because in his suit, he was putting a lien on the house. So here she paid almost the equivalent of $900,000 in today's money for a one-room house in a floodplain. And she was going to lose not just the investment, but the house itself.
Sounds like it's a job for Judge Judy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It was, God, if only Judge Judy had been around for this. Yeah, I mean, she certainly had motivation to countersue. But yeah, the narrative, I think, that's long been believed is that she was just an extraordinary pain in the ass. And I'm sure she was, but not without reason,
This is part of a series of stories that we hear all the time about women not being taken seriously.
Yeah, I think, it was the 1950s. I mean, a lot of women weren't taken seriously in a lot of aspects of life, right? I mean, even down to the trial, they used what's called a master in chancery to sort of determine the outcome of the trial. And I think that worked to Edith's advantage because had they had a jury trial, you could legally exclude women from juries.
What is a master in chancery?
So master in chancery, it actually comes from England. It was how they determined the estates of lunatics and orphans. So, women, of course, fits right in, in the 50s, women fit right into that. It essentially is the idea in the United States, the way it's practiced in law is essentially that you have a judge with trial experience, and that judge becomes essentially you could think of them as the jury for a case.
Like an arbitrator, in a sense, right?
An arbitrator,
like
exactly.
a
They hear
bench
both
trial
sides.
kind of.
Yeah, they hear both sides and they write up their findings and make the recommendation to the presiding judge to take into consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how did it turn out for Edith and Mies?
I mean, it turned out great for Edith, if you think about it. So I would say it got real messy. So they had these 6 weeks of hearings. Evidence was brought into the room. evidence was thrown out. Like, so it was really weird. Edith would bring photographs of like a hole in the roof, and the attorney on Mies's side would argue that it was a trick photograph. It wasn't to be believed, that she was, doing suspicious witchcraft or something. So
this is before Photoshop.
Yeah, before the internet, she was doing suspicious witchcraft.
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
Now, was this trial going on during the construction or after the construction, or?
Great question. So the trial was taking place immediately after she moved into the house.
Okay.
So it was like right after Mies got his photographs of it, she was served a summons. He hired his favorite photographer. He went in, took the photographs, and then boom, she got the summons.
It's always those damn accountants that are causing trouble.
Yeah, I know. And that guy ended up, I think he committed suicide. It was a pretty sad story.
Oh.
So it wasn't a great story for anybody, to be honest. The trial was going on from, I think, 1951 to 55. It dragged on forever. It ended up being dragged into the media. So a lot of the, the House Beautiful articles that call the Farnsworth House a threat to democracy were, I think, in some ways, Edith attempting to sort of get into the court of public opinion around her victimhood relative to living in a glass house. And she made it sound like it was a terrible place to live. Of course, this was only maybe partially true because she wasn't exactly looking to move out of the house. And then on Mies's side, he also turned to the press. So he partnered with McCormick to build the McCormick House. And then they were going to, in Elmhurst, the glass house in Elmhurst. And then they were thinking about doing a whole subdivision of glass houses. So there were pieces in the Chicago Tribune talking about how great it is to live in a glass house. It offers maximum flexibility. So it gets really sloppy. Things are kind of pushed into the press where they try to get some empathy on either side around, whether a glass house is terrible or fantastic. And ultimately, I believe they settled out of court. And I think Edith paid something like $2,000 or $3,000. And what I've read is that Mies just wanted it to be over, that after being kind of dragged through the mud in House Beautiful, which, is a publication that had quite a bit of reach in the 1950s, he just didn't want this trial to go on any longer. He wanted it to be completed and wrapped up and just move on with his life.
And Edith sold it, around 68?
Mm-hmm. I think it actually took some time. She put it on the market in 68. And I think even listed it like in the classifieds in the Chicago Tribune. But she ended up selling it to Lord Peter Palumbo later on. They had to work out an arrangement because Palumbo didn't want to pay the extra taxes that a British citizen has to pay for a property outside of England. So he gave her money in the form of a, quote, scholarship that she took as basically her fund to move to Italy and buy a gigantic 15th century villa there. So they kind of worked out a sale that really worked for her, I think, and worked for Palumbo because she wanted to fund this fabulous life in Italy. So it worked out for both of them.
At what point did they begin to notice the Fox River coming up?
It flooded during construction. So there's a really great photo of the house with the river rising up to the floor in about I think it was the summer of 1950. So construction had begun, the steel structures in place, and the river rose up. So they knew even during construction that this was going to happen. But, they didn't know about climate change yet. So, maybe they thought that was as bad as it would get. I don't know.
In your book, you have this great narrative, sort of step by step, month by month. Here's what Edith is doing, thinking, writing in her journals. And what I think makes this book absolutely unique and fascinating is that you also tell your personal story of what it's like to progress through a world where women aren't taken very seriously still today, misinterpreted.
Yeah.
One of the things that you go into some detail about the book, which I just found horrifying, is that you got accused of harassment by a student who thought you were dating.
Yeah, it was pretty terrifying. It was really weird. And I don't know what to think about it, except that the student had this kind of weird delusion where, and I don't know if he really believed it or if this was like his only recourse after he got a grade he earned, which wasn't a great grade because he wasn't doing well in class. And then he decided, because we went through the grade appeals process, and the grade appeals process said, no, you earned this grade. And the next thing I found out was I was being invited to the Title IX office to talk about a relationship with a student. And I was like, what are you talking about? But it was a kind of shocking process because I realized you don't really have any recourse. Like if you are, especially as a woman, accused of being in a relationship with a student, even if it's not true, you are opening up an entire investigation into your body. So I was questioned about what I wore in the classroom, questions about why I spoke one-on-one with students instead of just lecturing to them all, had to explain what a studio class was and why it means that you talk to students directly. But it was like everything I did was brought into this court of deep suspicion because I was a woman. And I remember coming back to my office thinking, would they ask one of my male colleagues about like, oh, you wore a blue button-down shirt that day. That was very suspicious. What made you do that? It was so weird. It was like anything I did was sort of viewed with suspicion. And I started to think, oh, it's because women's bodies don't belong in spaces of authority. Like we still don't think they belong there. And even though we have Title IX, arguably to protect women from harassment, it felt like this harassing instrument. It was totally bizarre. And so as frustrated as I was that the student made this allegation, in the end, it was really more the institution and dealing with the sort of institutionalized way in which my body was viewed that ended up being much more problematic. I mean, you're going to have students do crazy things all the time. It's like part and parcel of being a professor. It's your life.
And I assume there was no recourse against the student for making this spurious claim.
No.
Yeah.
No, and in fact, they continued to make claims. Like they said that I showed up at their workplace and got them fired. And I don't even know where that person worked. And I said, how many times are they going to be allowed to do this? And I was told there's no limit. Students can make as many claims as they want.
And so now you're in New Mexico.
I am, yes.
And you've been working on this book. And another fascinating story from your book is that as you were researching Edith and Mies and so forth, of course, you looked at other books that had been written about this.
Yeah.
And I believe you tell the story about how you were having dinner with one of these authors and asking him why he kind of made these inferences that there was some sort of affair there. And what did he tell you?
He said, you always need a good story. A writer needs a good story.
Yeah.
Something like that. It was Franz Schulz, actually, who wrote the foundational mythic account of the love affair between Mies and Edith. And so I wanted to have, dinner with him and ask him. And he generously agreed to meet me. I mean, it wasn't like he was hiding. He knew I was going to ask questions and he was honest. And I appreciate that he was honest.
Yeah.
He didn't try to
hide it
make
over.
something up and say, oh, I have secret evidence you don't know about. He genuinely kind of said, well, I needed a good story. I don't think he understood really the damage that would do for decades.
When did he first write that?
1985. It was in a biography of Mies van der Rohe.
So a long time.
A long time ago. Yeah. And it became the kind of, because it's a good story. Oh, of course it went sideways. She was in love with him. Of course she was. Look at Mies. He's amazing. It was such an easy thing to believe. But I think if you're a woman, it's also a really easy thing to see through.
When did Edith die? I'm assuming she's no longer with us.
Yeah, I think it was 1978.
Okay, so this was all after she was gone.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course. That's the other thing. It's, it's really easy to write about dead people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he interviewed her sister, who at many points in her life was estranged from Edith. They had, I think, a complicated relationship. And the sister said, oh, she was always obsessed with him. And I think that was the creative license that Franz probably needed to speculate. And, I think as historians or writers or artists, we're always projecting through historical artifacts and creating a little bit of mythos anyway. But I think it was just kind of a damaging thing to do because he really doubled down on the idea that they were absolutely in a love affair. And that was the catalyst for her anger. And she sued Mies. And so it just really kind of skewed the truth of things in such a remarkable way. And to undo that kind of narrative is hard. Like those trial transcripts no longer exist anywhere except in one guy's living room. So
wait a second. The trial transcripts are in one guy's living room now?
Yeah, who is that guy?
Yeah. What is his name? He's Ed Windhorst.
Okay.
So he has them in his living room because
did he buy him at a tag sale or something? What?
Practically. So the original version got destroyed at the courthouse. They built a new courthouse, so it's no longer and of course it was never digitized. This is the 50s. So Ed, he's a Mies scholar, and he happened to hear from the lawyers who represented Mies. They were cleaning out the basement decades later, and somebody said, oh, I bet this guy who's really into Mies van der Rohe would like to have a copy of this. And so they just were, unburdening themselves from decades of trial transcripts.
That's very
and
lucky
they reached out
to have found that.
It's extremely lucky. At the time when I was doing the research, it was the only physical copy. And of course, Ed is writing his own book. So he allowed me to come over and look at things and read them, but I couldn't photograph them. I couldn't, there was no way for me to extract what I needed from 4,000 pages. And eventually he generously allowed me to send a scanning company in there to scan everything. But, it was a pretty frustrating 6 months not knowing if I'd ever get more than those 2 afternoons I got, sitting at his dining room table.
So things turned out okay for Edith in the end. And for you, in the end, we get to see both her story and yours. Mm-hmm. I've been hearing, Nora, for, I guess, 6 or 7 years, that there's been a movie under development about Edith and Mies, and it keeps getting delayed or the script rewritten or new stars cast. Have you heard anything more about it lately?
No, not really. I mean, I guess the latest I heard, which I thought was interesting, is that Maggie Gyllenhaal, I think, is the executive producer. I think at one point she was going to play Edith, and now she's the executive producer, which I think is really interesting. I think it's great that there's a woman involved.
Yeah, especially her.
And I think Richard Press has been writing it. Richard Press used to reach out to me from time to time with updates or questions, but it's probably been a decade since I've heard from him. So I hope it happens.
I hope so, too. If you hear anything, please let me know.
I will. And vice versa. If you hear anything, let me know. I would love to know who's making it. I'd love to mail them a copy of the book.
The book is Almost Nothing, Reclaiming Edith Farnsworth. Thanks for joining us again, Nora.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me back.
That was our conversation with Nora Wendl, talking about Edith Farnsworth and her house. Todd Gannon is a professor of architecture at Ohio State. He taught at the University of Minnesota and in Los Angeles at the Otis College of Art and Design, UCLA, and SCI-Arc. Todd has BA and MA degrees from Ohio State.
Go Buckeyes.
And a PhD from UCLA.
Go Bruins.
His new book, Franklin D. Israel, explores the influential Los Angeles architect of the same name and his experiences as a gay man. His career was cut tragically short by AIDS at the age of 50. But on a happier note, we've learned that Todd likes big books, and he cannot lie. Umberto Eco, Roberto Bolaño, Zadie Smith, Vladimir Nabokov, and Thomas Pynchon.
Welcome to the show, Todd.
Thank you for having me. I'm interested to hear where you're doing your reconnaissance work now after that introduction.
So, yes, we have a great research team, and we're wondering, what's your latest big book?
I've been working on writing books lately, so what book is on my shelf? I just finished reading a collection of essays by Ann Patchett, which was really great.
Okay.
Was it big?
No.
Okay.
But it was rich. So,
okay.
Yeah, like a small slice of cheesecake, Tom.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah. I have to say I'm a fan of Umberto Eco, too. I think it was Foucault's Pendulum. Is that how you say it?
Foucault.
And Name of the Rose, which were novels he wrote in the 1980s, are just amazing.
Those are some good ones.
So, Todd, what drew you to study Franklin Israel?
Well, that goes back probably about 12 or 13 years. I had curated, while I was still at SCI-Arc, I had curated an exhibition which was part of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time Presents series on architecture in 2013. That show was called The Confederacy of Heretics, and it looked at the kind of early years of a generation of LA architects that came to be known as the LA School. People like Frank Gehry and Tom Main and Coy Howard and Eric Moss. And we did the exhibition. I co-curated that exhibition with Andrew Zago of SCI-Arc and Ewan Branda, who at the time was at Woodbury University. And I got to know some people at the Getty pretty well in the course of doing that work. And I got a call one day, not long after the show was up and running, from Gail Feigenbaum. I don't remember her exact title, but Gail was at the Getty Research Institute. And Gail asked if I might be interested in doing some work on Frank Israel. They had just finished cataloging their archival holdings on Frank's work. And the Research Institute was very interested in having more projects being done on their archival holdings. So I said, sure, I'd love to. And then I suggested another book that I could do, which wound up turning into my first book with the Getty, which was Rainer Banham and the Paradoxes of High Tech, which came out in 2017. So I agreed to write this book quite a long time ago and wound up actually writing it over the last 5 years or so.
First time I came across Frank Israel, did it go by Frank or Franklin?
It appears Frank to most of his friends.
Okay. The first time I came across Frank Israel was when he was being interviewed by Charlie Rose on TV.
Right.
I guess that would have been in the early 90s?
Early to mid 90s, that's right.
Yeah. He was obviously very well respected, but hadn't really got on the national radar at all at that point.
That's right. Yeah, Frank was an interesting character. So by the time that he was on Charlie Rose, I believe that interview was around 1994 or maybe even 95. It was not long before his death. And Frank at that moment was just starting to get pretty regular national attention on a fairly small portfolio of completed works. When Frank died, he had 3 freestanding buildings to his name. And his portfolio was primarily residential additions and office interiors. But he had quite a bit of work underway, and he had been profiled a couple of times in the New York Times by Herbert Mouchamp, who had been the architecture critic there through the 1990s. And so Frank was getting quite a lot of attention as this up-and-coming figure, both in Los Angeles and nationally. And he was someone who, since his school days, was very good at building a kind of, I guess what we would call today, a kind of media buzz around the work that he was doing. So he was making a small portfolio appear to be substantial from the time that he was an undergrad. And he had an incredible amount of success at that throughout his career.
He was well connected to Hollywood.
He was. When he first came to Los Angeles in 1977, he was invited to teach just 10 weeks at UCLA. Charles Moore invited him to come out. He was in New York at the time. And he came to UCLA. He was teaching part-time. The gig was not permanent. And he needed to make ends meet. So he soon began writing for magazines. He wrote for GQ for a little while. He wrote for Architectural Digest. He wrote for Progressive Architecture. And on a whim, one of his students mentioned that her husband worked for a special effects company called Bob Abel and Associates. Bob Abel made his name making TV commercials for Levi's and 7-Up and Toyota. And the commercials were notable for their high-end special effects. You may remember some of these. They were doing a lot of experimental motion graphics stuff. And at the time, the digital technology was really in its infancy. So a lot of this stuff had to be created by hand. And Abel wound up employing a lot of architects who helped him build sets and models and set up these effects. And so Frank wound up working for Bob Abel very soon after he came to Los Angeles. And within a few months of working in Abel's office, he was working on the special effects for Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Oh, wow.
You'll see in the archive some drawings. Some seem to have come from Frank. Some seem to have come from elsewhere on the team. But he was working on Star Trek for a little while, and then he wound up working on a film that Roger Vadim made, terrible movie, called Night Games. It starred Cindy Pickett, who you might know.
Yeah. Oh, yes. She was his love interest at the time, I believe.
Vadim? Yeah,
Yes.
I think you're right. Listeners would know Cindy Pickett as Ferris Bueller's mom.
Okay. Yep.
And this was a few years ahead of Ferris Bueller. It was a kind of erotic thriller. Again, like not a great film, but it was shot in the Philippines. And Frank's role was production designer. And basically what he did was took these buildings in Manila and made them over to look like they were in Bel Air.
Oh.
And they shot the movie there because it was significantly cheaper to do so. So he spent about 6 months in Manila. He worked in China on some films for a while and made a ton of connections in Hollywood very early on. And then this was compounded by the fact that Frank Gehry, who Israel met very early upon his arrival in Los Angeles, Frank Gehry recommended him to several Hollywood clients. So when Joe Wilder and Joel Grey came to Gehry to ask for help with the House edition, Gehry recommended Israel instead. He recommended Rita Moreno to work with Frank. And so he was a really good networker. And he was a very friendly and gregarious guy. And he was able to make these connections and then maintain them. So he very quickly developed this huge network throughout the entertainment industry. And a lot of those people became his earliest clients.
The first houses I can find for him were one for the Kleins in 1970, and then for the Snells in 72. I think the Kleins were in Los Angeles and the Snells were in New York. Is that right? Were they the first ones?
The Snell House was his first standalone project. It was on Long Island. And he got the commission for that project from the camp doctor and nurse, who were a married couple at the camp that he attended as a kid. When he was growing up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, starting around the age of 12 or so, he started attending a camp in Western Massachusetts called Camp Tahoney. At that camp, he met Aaron Copland through that camp.
Wow.
The camp was very near Tanglewood.
Okay.
And they sometimes would have the campers go to Tanglewood and act as like lackeys for the composers. And so Frank was running around bringing sandwiches and lemonade to Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein. And then years later, after he'd become an architect, the camp doctor called him up and said, we've got this little piece of property on Long Island. Would you build us something?
He really knew how to leverage connections.
That's the thing. And it was such fun doing research on this project because I dug up a lot of these connections that he had made. And I interviewed 80 or 90 people in the course of my research. And it was incredible to see this network that he had woven throughout the entertainment industry, throughout architecture. I mean, he seemed to know just absolutely everybody. And everybody really liked him. This was another thing that was kind of interesting as I did the research, that nobody ever said anything bad about him, which is unusual for architects.
Oh, yes. They can be very snipey with each other.
That's right.
Todd, your book is called Franklin D. Israel, but there's another book that Frank Gehry wrote called Franklin D. Israel. And there's another book that Pamela Johnston and Maggie Toy wrote called Franklin D. Israel.
Oh.
So who's going to come up with a new title for this guy?
Well, I want to clarify some of those titles a little bit. First,
Okay.
The Frank Gehry title, that was a monograph that Frank Israel put together on his own work.
Okay.
And Frank Gehry wrote the foreword.
Got it.
So that was a monograph of Frank's work, and Frank was responsible for that title. The other title you mentioned, I believe, is the architectural design monograph that came out on Frank a couple of years after that. So the first monograph came out in 92. The AD monograph came out in 94. And that was also called Franklin D. Israel. So I guess we need a new title, but
Franklin D. Israel, the guy everybody likes.
Yes.
there is an Italian title that is also Franklin D. Israel. Let me put it this way. When you look at Frank's body of work, yes, the main titles are always Franklin D. Israel, but the subtitles are where the interest happens. Lorenzo Spagnolo's was Franklin D. Israel, La creazione del disordine, so the creation of disorder.
Well, that's good.
And the subtitle of mine is A Life in Architecture. So I was really looking as much as at the buildings that Frank had designed as at his life, both as a practicing architect and as a gay man kind of navigating the field through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, which was not the friendliest period.
In operating in Los Angeles, did he have to hide his orientation from clients?
Frank was not one to hide his sexuality, but he wasn't one to advertise it very loudly either. In the interviews where he discusses his sexuality and in the interviews that I conducted, Frank wasn't trying to hide anything, but I think he was also not trying to broadcast. His interest was being known for the work that he was doing rather than for his sexuality.
Yes. Well, of course.
Put it this way, I think that was a moment where it would have been much more typical for a professional in architecture to leave the question of one's sexuality to be much more ambiguous.
Mm.
So I think it was generally known that certain practitioners were gay, but it was not discussed.
How long into his career was he diagnosed with AIDS?
The record is a little bit unclear. There are several boxes of Frank's medical records that are kept at the Getty among his papers, and they've been sealed until 2062 or something. I think it's 50 years after the collection had been cataloged. That said, from what I've been able to gather, it appears that Frank began to feel sick very early, before AIDS was even called AIDS, before it was even called GRID. Frank seems to have started to notice swollen lymph nodes and just feeling kind of off somewhere around 1982. He had had a previous partner who became ill and very quickly died right around that time. So Frank was positive and knew he was positive for roughly the last 12 years of his life, 13 years of his life.
So he was working through AIDS. I mean, suffering from AIDS while he was a working architect, right?
Yes, very much so. And his condition and the managing of his illness was very much a part of the everyday life of the office. He had assistants who would scour Southern California for vitamins and supplements and the various medications that he was taking. He was back and forth into Cedars-Sinai for treatments very regularly. And managing his illness was very much part of his day-to-day life. And really the last few years of his life, when the illness progressed, really became a factor in how the office was operating.
And the 50-year lockout, is that something he requested or that the Getty imposed?
I'm not sure. I don't know if that's a Getty policy or if that's something that came from Frank's estate. But I think it's not uncommon for archival materials to have restrictions like that placed upon them.
It is fairly uncommon, actually.
Well, it's a restriction that is on this archive.
Okay.
And it was not one that I could do anything about.
Okay. I just wanted to ask the question because I know some families do ask for that and most do not.
Yeah, I'm not sure where it came from. And to tell you the truth, I never asked. I was able to gather enough information from the people that Frank were close to that I felt I could tell the story that I needed to tell.
Sure. How do you think Frank Israel's body of work is viewed now in 2025?
To be quite honest, I feel that it's been forgotten in large part. I was just speaking to a colleague earlier today. He's maybe in his mid to late 30s. And mentioned that he had never heard of Frank Israel and went and looked him up and found the Charlie Rose interview, the first thing, and watched it. And he's like, how did I not know about this guy? Well, when I first encountered Frank Israel, I was a graduate student. This would have been in the mid-1990s. I was a graduate student here at Ohio State. And Frank's monographs were open on the desks in our design studio all the time. We were ripping them off like crazy. And there were certain modeling techniques that we were really interested in trying to replicate, where he would kind of crumple paper and put it onto the models. And I remember vividly trying to figure out how to do that and not use too much glue and have the paper turn to muck. Yeah. So there was a moment when I was coming into the field that Frank was seemingly everywhere. He was in the New York Times. He was on Charlie Rose in Los Angeles. He was very much part of the scene. And then after he passed away, there were a handful of retrospective publications and events. And then he kind of faded from interest. And I find that very curious. And I hope that this book will do something to bring some attention back to his contributions, because I think that he was, on one hand, very much a part of the LA school and in many ways operating in a kind of similar mode to offices like Morphosis or Hodgetts and Fung or Eric Moss or even Frank Gehry. On the other hand, Israel had a reverence for classicism that you can see in the work. The work is very much made of fragmented forms and juxtaposed materials, and there's a real kind of, I don't want to say deconstructivist energy, but I'll say deconstructivist. There's a kind of language that makes it very much of Los Angeles in the 1990s. The structure of the plans has a kind of classicism to it that is very unusual for that moment. And there's a kind of polish, a sort of fastidiousness that I think comes through in the work that really contrasts the kind of roughness of somebody like Frank Gehry, or the aggressiveness of somebody like Eric Moss, or the sort of drive toward the new that you'll find in the work of Tom Main. That Israel had this sort of classical restraint that I think makes the work really interesting, the way that it's sort of a very contemporary language and a more historically grounded diagram come together in the planning in particular. You can really see this in the plans, and I try to tease that out descriptively in the book.
You can see all of Frank Israel's houses at usmodernist.org/Israel. The new book is Franklin D. Israel by Todd Gannon. Todd, thank you so much for joining us.
George, thanks so much for having me on. It's been really great to talk to you.
We were talking with Todd Gannon.
Marianne Hunting and Kevin Murphy are the authors of Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism. This new book covers the remarkably overlooked contributions of women architects in modernism from 1916 to 1942. Our guest spent more than 10 years traveling to 16 states, gathering archival information and interviewing descendants. Marianne Hunting has a BA from Vanderbilt,
Go Commodores.
a PhD from City University of New York,
Go Beavers.
and a master's from Parsons.
Go Design.
Okay. And she is the author of Edward Durrell Stone, Modernism's Populist Architect. Kevin Murphy is an art history professor at Vanderbilt with a PhD from Northwestern.
Go Wildcats.
He's taught at the City University of New York.
More Beavers.
Oh, no. And at the University of Virginia.
Go Cavaliers.
Kevin is also the co-author of Skyscraper Gothic, Medieval Style and Modernist Buildings. Welcome, Marianne and Kevin.
Hello.
Thank you.
Kevin, before we start talking about the book, I wanted to ask you, what's the latest on the reconstruction of Notre Dame? You've spent many months in France, and I was wondering, in the process of putting all this back, what upgrades did they do that didn't exist a millennia ago?
Well, I'll just talk about the upgrades since before the fire. I wrote a short book about Notre Dame that covers its whole history. And one of the things that I argue is that, in fact, it's just been basically a construction zone since for over 1,000 years. So the building was just constantly evolving and decaying and being deliberately destroyed and restored and so on. But this most recent restoration seems as though it's going to result in an absolutely beautiful interior, much more pristine than what existed before the fire.
It is open to the public now, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And you're going there soon, aren't you?
Yes, I'm going in May to see it. So after that, I'll have a much better sense of what it looks like.
Well, I guess this is the difference between a maintenance budget and a construction budget, right? I mean, you can really afford to do it right if you've got a couple of billion at hand.
Right, exactly. And that's been a chronic issue in France since the 19th century, when there was the first big restoration effort in the 1840s. And the funding in that case was really premised on the same idea as this time around, which is that this is more than just a religious building. It's a national icon. And it has to look good because it's right in the center of Paris.
Marianne, tell me, how did the two of you decide to do this project? You've been working on it for a long time, and the book is the output for that. How did it all get started?
You know, it's an interesting story because I was Kevin Murphy's, I studied under him, and I took a class, if you can believe, 25 years ago from Kevin. It was a seminar on basically domestic architecture. And I wrote an article on a woman named Ethel Brown Power for the class. Power was the editor of House Beautiful in the 1930s and 1920s. And she was the life partner of Eleanor Raymond, a very important woman architect that Kevin was interested in. Subsequently, he wrote about Raymond. I still was interested in power. And when I finished my book on Edward Durrell Stone, we decided we'd pick up this interest of ours and continue on because we suspected that there was so much more out there than anyone knew. And our research got interrupted, obviously, by COVID and, had a hard time getting into some public institutions. But we moved from a student-mentor relationship to a collaborator relationship. And the whole process, it was fascinating.
How did you pick the women you were going to profile in the book?
So we had to begin somewhere. And both Ethel Power and Eleanor Raymond had attended the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, graduating in 1919 and 1920. And so because they had this in common, we went and we looked at those archives. We knew those archives were at Smith College, and we figured out pretty quickly that they were quite in depth. So we decided we'd start looking at these women who attended this architecture school. It was an all-women's architecture school between 1960 and 1942, after which the school closed and the women were invited to transfer to Harvard, who finally opened its doors to women because of wartime attrition of male students. So we focused on them and on that period and that group of people. And then we developed some primary themes and some consistencies we began to see. And then we opened it up and looked for other women to bring in who we felt complemented and who also fell pretty strongly under the themes that we established for the book.
And then did you hit the road? Did you go from town to town trying to find the families?
Here's the fascinating piece. All of our women were dead that we were studying from the Cambridge School, except for one, and she was 99. So we were able to interview her. But the rest of them, we had to get online, and it's all because of online research now, find the obituaries, and then track down the descendants. There are not a lot of public archives for women or public records. And so a lot of it was in the basement and the attics of these descendants. And the response of the descendants varied from beyond enthusiastic to, oh, I barely knew my mother went to architecture school.
Really?
That was pretty fascinating, but it was very much private collections that we had to, and that is what took so long, was to get into those collections and, get these people to open up their hearts.
And they were literally all over the country between California and Maine.
So, Kevin, is there a good buddy movie in this where we see you and Marianne in your car driving from home to home?
Well, I think the highlight would be when we went to visit this woman in Montana who is herself a sculptor and a rancher. And her mother was trained as an architect. Anne Elizabeth Campbell Knapp was her name. She trained as an architect. She married a Princeton musicologist, and her father was known as the developer of industrial farming and owned these ranches that were just thousands of acres in Montana and the Southwest. So when he died in the 60s, she would be like the Princeton University professor's wife during the academic year, that she would go out to Montana and she would run these massive ranches. And so we went out to visit her daughter and her daughter's husband, who were just wonderful. And we went out to the ranch and we went to her office in Billings, Montana, where she had like all of her school papers, drawings, photographs of the architecture students going to visit Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water when it was still under construction. And we were kind of marveling at all that. And she said, well, I still have her car in the barn on the ranch. It's the car she drove when she was at the Cambridge School. And it was a Ford or something with a rumble seat. from the 1930s. So that was kind of I think the high point of our
You had a car
road
from the
tripping.
30s and a barn?
I bet there's a
Yeah.
lot of barns with cars in the 30s.
Wow.
But she's also a sculptor?
The daughter, yeah.
Yeah, Phoebe Knapp. Yeah, she
Okay.
herself is also a sculptor.
So how did women architects during that time interpret modernism differently, say, than their male counterparts?
You know, I'm not sure if I'd call it interpret. I think it would be the experience was so different for them.
What was different?
Well, because I think male architects tended to have a pretty clear-cut trajectory of going to graduate school, possibly winning some scholarships, some scholarship money to travel abroad and look at modern architecture abroad. They had mentors, and during their college education, at least at Harvard, they were required to practice in an architecture firm in order to get their degree. Women, first of all, could not get these jobs, summer jobs, or in the architecture firms, and that could not be part of their requirement. Second of all, each woman's professional path is different. No two were alike. And the reason is the traditional method of going to the architecture schools run by males, starting as draftsmen, moving into partnership, or moving into design, and then either moving into a partnership or developing their own firm. It just isn't the way it was for women because of sexism and lack of opportunity. You had the Depression in there. So they had to be really, really creative about where and how they were going to use their professional degree. And even if they ended up in architecture in their own firm, in some cases working for a larger firm, but that was rare, they usually had been sidelined somewhere along the way to continue to get work and exposure. So it was very different for women.
Can I jump in and just talk about their view of modernism? Because that was something we thought about a lot. So, for example, Power and Raymond were hugely appreciative of contemporary European modernism. They made a number of trips to Europe where they specifically sought out examples of modern architecture, contemporary architecture, and they were particularly enamored of Corbusier in France. But what we began to see was that they brought back to the U.S. those ideas and they melded them with a deep appreciation for American vernacular architecture. And in fact, they articulated what they saw as similarities between traditional, kind of everyday American architecture and modern architecture, particularly functionalism, authentic use of materials, things like that, local materials. And so they attempted a kind of synthesis that I think was quite unique.
Marianne, when you were interviewing this 99-year-old architect, what did she share with you?
She was a twin, and both she and her twin had gone to Radcliffe. And during their senior year at Radcliffe, the Cambridge School had invited Radcliffe students to take classes. And so they had taken a class over at the Cambridge School and decided to go on and apply to the Cambridge School. And it's interesting because they dressed alike. They were pictured. They were all on scholarship. They were like the pride and joy of, the family town going to this architecture school. And then when the Cambridge School closed, one of them, the one I talked to, decided to apply to Harvard and go to Harvard. And the other one decided not to go, even though they were offered a scholarship, I think because she got married.
Okay.
So they split by that point. But we have a quote in our book about this architect who was almost at death's door. And she said, with so much enthusiasm, you cannot imagine the fun we had. And she talked about putting together a traveling exhibition for the Cambridge School that they would put in the backseat of a car and then go across mainly the East Coast and try to sell the Cambridge School to primarily the Seven Sisters and other colleges. And she had worked on that exhibition and just thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And there was nothing, I'm not sure her career matched her enthusiasm as a student. So it was contagious.
This road trip was the thing that was the most fun?
She loved working on that exhibition. It was the exhibition for the road trip. It was a big deal. It was written up. The school has such good archives. They have bulletins. They had quarterly bulletins that reported on everything going on at the school, which is why we could figure out so many names and projects and where they ended up and when they got married and all of this. And this exhibition that they put together in 1940 apparently was a very big deal. And it was discussed a lot in the bulletin. So that's why it was sort of interesting that she brought it up too. Out of everything in her career was this working on this exhibition and being at the school.
Kevin, in researching these women architects, did the two of you discover any fascinating buildings from that time that are still around that are now going to get some recognition perhaps because of the book?
Well, actually, when Marianne was talking, I was thinking more about one that got torn down.
Okay.
Which was this house of this woman that Marianne's talking about, Frances Corton, in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is where she practiced with a male architect. They had a partnership and they did lots of modern houses in that area. We went to see the house at the moment that its owner was building this kind of McMansion in front of it and was on the brink of tearing it down. So we got there within weeks of it being demolished.
But we asked the contractor if we could go look at the house, and he told us no. So I think we kind of tried anyway. He threatened the police on us.
Really?
All right.
Haven't managed to find the contractor's, place of business and get permission to go in and see it. And literally it was torn down like the next week. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for getting photographs of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other great find was this little cabin in the woods in New Hampshire that was designed by a woman named Florence Luscombe, who's extremely well known as a suffragist. And she was an early graduate of MIT in architecture, and then she went to the Cambridge School and did landscape architecture. And in the 1930s, she built this tiny cabin. I think it was about 200 square feet or something, but incredibly well thought out. It had bunk beds that raised and lowered so that she could maximize the number of people who could sleep there. It was totally off the grid. And she really designed it to be a retreat for herself and her friends who tended to be politically progressive. And the design, a lot of the correspondence about constructing it are all preserved. So there was a ton of documentation. There were lots of photos, but nobody had ever really gone to see if the house was still there. So we were up in New Hampshire looking at some papers, and Marianne says, why don't we go try and find the Florence Luscombe cabin? So we go over to where we thought it was, and it didn't seem to be there. And I'm like, oh, forget it. It's been demolished. Let's go home. And Marianne, in her very determined way, said, no, let's keep walking out in the woods and see if we can find it. And indeed, we found it, kind of, half falling down, but still very much there. And that was one of the great finds of our research, not because it's some exquisite work of modern architecture, but that it's this really functionalist, super well-documented, incredibly intentional work of architecture that this woman who had a 10-year career in architecture went on to have great notoriety as an activist, but there really are no examples of her work existing except this poor little cabin in the woods in New Hampshire.
Is it still there?
We are now.
The last time we were there, it was there, but it was in very dilapidated condition.
The book is Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism. Thank you both for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Singer Gabrielle Stravelli earned her BFA from the University of Cincinnati Conservatory of Music.
Go Bearcats!
She represented the U.S. State Department as a jazz ambassador and teaches master classes all across the U.S. For 3.5 years, she headlined the popular jazz brunch every Sunday at Le Pescadeur in Manhattan's Soho. And she has appeared with the Santa Rosa Symphony, the Nelson Riddle Orchestra, the New Jersey Festival Orchestra, and the Cincinnati Pops. Frequently appearing at Birdland, her latest album is Beautiful Moons Ago. George recently tracked Gabrielle Stravelli down for a chat over lunch.
We are sitting at a taco place because you've got to get the interviews wherever you can.
And you knew the way to my heart, apparently.
And there's a little traffic behind us. There are a couple of screaming kids on the other side, but we're going to do as best as we can. Thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So our ACE research team uncovered
Oh, Lord.
that you went to Howell High School.
I did.
Right?
Yes.
And there was a Mr. Green involved.
There
and
was.
And you won something with Mr. Green.
Did I win something with Mr. Green? Wow, you guys know more about me than I do. So I'm a New York native.
Yeah.
And then when I was about 8 years old, my family moved to New Jersey, my 2 siblings and I. And so Howell wasn't really the school in my district, but they had some different magnet schools. And there actually was a performing arts program.
Oh,
But I was
okay,
already
great.
doing there were some really excellent sort of regional and local theaters. And my mom really wanted me to get a strong academic background. And so there was this magnet program called the Scholars Center for the Humanities at Howell High School. And it was an incredible program with an emphasis on arts and history, culture. And yeah, Mr. Green was the man who led that program.
Okay.
I also studied French with his wife, who I adored. And Mr. Green led a fantastic program that gave us such a well-rounded education there. And he actually encouraged me to apply to the Young Arts Foundation. I actually work with them now as a teacher all these years later, but back then they sort of invite high school age kids to audition. You know, they're looking for really good teenagers across the arts, across mediums. And I didn't win, but I got an honorable mention. But because of that honorable mention, I was recruited by the Cincinnati Conservatory, and that's where I went to college.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Go Bearcats.
That's right. We've got catitude.
You've done some really exciting residencies in New York.
Yes.
What are some of those?
I've worked a lot at Birdland. That's kind of one of my musical homes, and I feel very, very lucky to be able to say that. But we have done a number of, like Saturday, they have a Saturday residency there, 5:30 p.m. in the big main room upstairs. And we just finished one. We were there every Saturday in March this last month. And that audience is always so wonderful. The club is a great club to play. And those residencies for me are a great opportunity. You know, we had a different pianist each week. And I mean, Adam Birnbaum, Michael Kanan, Josh Richmond, Willem Delisfort, Miki Yamanaka has played with us. Just beautiful, beautiful players who I'm so fortunate to have this opportunity to rope them into playing with me.
Well, this first song is I'm Just a Lucky So-and-So. It was composed in 1945 by Duke Ellington with lyrics by Mac David. Ella Fitzgerald first recorded it for Decca Records in New York in 1946, and it's now part of the Great American Songbook. Here's Gabriella with I'm Just a Lucky So-and-So.
When I walk down the street, seems everyone I meet gives me a friendly hello. I guess I'm just a lucky so-and-so. The birds up in the trees all sing so neighborly. They sing wherever I go. I guess that means that I am just a lucky so-and-so. If you're gonna ask me the amount in my bank account, well, I'd have to admit that I'm slipping. But confidentially, that don't worry me. I've got a dream that's a pippin'. So when that day is through, each night I hurry to a home where love waits, I know. I guess I'm just a lucky so-and-so. When I walk down that street, seems that everyone gives me a friendly hello. so. The birds up in the trees all seem so neighborly. They sing wherever I go. I guess I'm just a lucky so-and-so. If you're gonna ask me the amount that's in my bank account, well, I'd have to admit that I'm slipping. But confidentially, that don't worry me, for I've got a drinking that's a pippin'. So when the day is through, he's not a go and hurry to home where love waits, I know. I guess that means I'm just a lucky soul. My bank account, well, I'd have to admit that I'm slipping. But confidentially, that don't worry me, for I've got a dream that's a pippin'. So when that day is through, it's not I hurry to a home where love waits alone. I guess that means that I am just a lucky so-and-so.
I'm going to take a moment to be a song nerd.
Yeah.
I love seeing how all these writers connect with one another. And you mentioned that Mac David wrote the lyrics for Lucky So-and-So. He was the brother of Hal David, who wrote all those lyrics for Burt Bacharach.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with this song. I only discovered it last year. It is also Ellington and Mac David. Great, great, great ballad called Don't You Know I Care, or Don't You Care to Know?
Oh, really?
Yes. It's a fabulous song. You never hear it.
That sounds like an Instagram title.
I mean, truly. I think I learned it off a Johnny Hartman record, if I'm not mistaken. So that's another fantastic Ellington-Mac David collaboration.
Has New York fully recovered in the jazz scene from COVID?
Well, yeah. I mean, I will say that based on the sort of liveliness of Birdland and Mesro and Smalls and the fact that Smoke expanded, I think in many ways it has. Yeah, we lost the Jazz Standard. You know, I'm not going to say that we didn't lose venues.
Yeah.
We lost beautiful players to COVID. You know, we got hit really, really hard. But I mean, Birdland is packed every time I walk in there.
That's super. Is the Iridium still around?
Yes, the Iridium is still around.
Okay.
The Jazz Standard was such a loss. N55 bar. You know, we lost some really, really good ones. But also, I mean, that's New York, right? It's constantly changing. You have to accept that is a part of the landscape and the way it's going to be
Danny's
there.
has been gone for a while, hasn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's where I saw Blossom Dearie way back.
That is my biggest regret. Living in New York and just thinking she'd be around forever.
Yeah.
And not getting my butt over there to see her while we still had her. I regret that so much.
Oh, yeah. She was amazing.
Yeah. I love Blossom.
What are your plans now for 2025? Are you going to just stay in New York every Saturday, or are you going to go on tour?
No. We've been really enjoying having quite a bit of travel this year. Our tacos just got delivered.
Arrived,
not to make you hungry
No.
or jealous. And that, I think, is another sign of recovery from COVID. We've been out on the road a lot more in the last 2-3 years. This year, Valentine's weekend, we were at the Walton Center Performing Arts Center in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Arkansas, sure.
Yeah,
Big architecture town.
I was floored. I had heard amazing things about Fayetteville.
Yeah.
And I was not disappointed. It's such a great town. That theater was beautiful and so nice to work at. So we were there. I was mentioning to you, George, earlier that Durham is the last stop on a 10-day tour. So I've been traveling with my husband, who's also my bass player and musical director, and we were really went up and down Florida before
So you defied
here.
your mother's advice, never date the bass player?
I did. That was, in fact, all I needed to hear to go ahead and date the bass player. We are in July heading to London for the Battersea Jazz Festival.
Wow.
I'm super
Yeah.
excited for that. And I think we're going to then head over to Italy for some gigs later in July. So we're getting out and about. There's a lot of travel this year, and my husband really made a road rat out of me. We love traveling. We love being in New York, and we love getting out of New York too, to perform and see what else is out there. So, yeah.
This next song is from her album Dream Ago, Cake of My Childhood.
Good to go.
Cake of my childhood, taste of cotton candy, lemon and lime, as only a child would. I'm running wild for the very first time. That's the cake of my childhood, tasting of cotton candy, lemon and lime, as only a child would. I'm running wild for the very first time. I was sitting in a pretty pink dress there upon my daddy's knee. He said, see that girlie in the mirror there? She can go and be whatever she wants to be. This world is your oyster, sitting in the palm of your hand. Don't worry, just jump on it. As long as there is gravity, then I know that you will land. Cake of my childhood, tasting of cotton candy, lemon and lime, as only good child would. I'm running wild for the very first time. Take my word, little one, he said. You know someday some fool will try to school ya. They'll put you down if they can, tell you that the world belongs to a man. But you know just what to do. Show 'em all you got and tell 'em I can cook too. If you conceive it, then just believe it. You do well to go and give 'em hell. Cake of my childhood, tasting of cotton candy, lemon and lime, as on the good childhood. I'm running wild for the very first time. some fool will try to school you. They'll put you down if they can. Tell you that the world belongs to a man. But you know just what to do. Show them all you got and tell them I can come too. If you can see that, then just believe it. You do well to go and give them hell. Cake of my childhood. Taking a cotton candy lemon in mine. As only a child would. I'm running wild for the very first time. As only a child would. I am running wild for the very first time.
What was this song inspired by?
Very related to what we were just talking about. There's two things that inspired it. One is that it really does tell the story. It talks a lot about my dad. We lost him, unfortunately, in 2008, but he was a beautiful man, a total cheerleader of mine. And so everything I say about him in the song is true. He really did just believe in me so much, and he encouraged me to believe in myself. But the song sort of came out of this incredible experience, a travel experience that I had in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. I got accepted into this incredible program that the U.S. State Department runs. It's a part of their...
Well, not anymore.
Well, a little birdie told me it may be coming back, believe it or not. So fingers crossed. Please, you guys, send all the good juju our way because we need this program now more than ever. It was originally called the Jazz Ambassadors Program, which it started in the 40s.
Absolutely.
And then at some point they sort of opened it up to more genres that are considered American. So gospel, musical theater, and they called it American Music Abroad. But I was accepted into that program in 2015. And I did, I want to say November 15, I did my first tour with them. It was a month-long tour, a different country every week. The first country that we visited was Moldova. And our first night there, we were having dinner. We were getting briefed on what our schedule was. We had a translator with us, of course. We were looking at the dessert menu. She said, I don't know what to tell you this dessert is going to be like, because the name of it translates in English to the cake of my childhood.
Wow.
And I just thought, well, we got to order that. I need to know what that means in Moldovan. And what a great turn of phrase. So I my husband was with me. I said, Pat, we have to write a song called The Cake of My Childhood. And I can remember some plane ride on that tour. I started writing it on the plane. It happened quite easily. So that is where The Cake of My Childhood comes from.
Gabrielle, thank you so much for talking with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's eat.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom?
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 25,000 significant modernist houses, and access 5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Simply Marvelous are her middle names. Or it could be Sally Mae. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Let's Eat with the Stars edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.